great to be with you. I want to thank Dr. Pybus and Dr. Schmidley especially for the invitation. It's also, I was thinking on the way down to drive down my second time in Springfield. The first time I was about 10 years old, visiting some cousins here the year that George Brett and the rest of the world were chasing the World Series. And there's one Catholic conversion about being back here and this time of the year now. I'm going to talk tonight on the ongoing and increasing tensions between religious liberty and certain other civil rights. I'm going to start with some observations about the current cultural moment. After that, I'm going to turn to the history, doctrine, and cultural significance of religious liberty. And then I'll close with a few words about pluralism, where my current book is heading. I'm going to begin, though, by laying my cards on the table here. I believe that religious liberty is vitally important to society. When we think about it, many of our most important institutions, hospitals, universities, and social service organizations, would not be where they are today without the churches that founded and nurtured them. And they have thrived in part because of religious liberty, and because religious liberty has long been viewed as among one of our most important civil rights, as opposed to in tension with it. These protections have also long focused not only on individual belief, but also on religious institutions. Notre Dame law professor Richard Garnett is surely right to argue that freedom of religion is not only lived and experienced in and through institutions, it is also protected, nourished, and facilitated by them. These institutions also provide billions of dollars of relief to the poor, both here and abroad. The row might get a lot of play in the pages of academic journals, but most Americans don't value religion from a walk around the pond. Now, while I'm sympathetic to religious liberty and the importance of religious institutions, I'm somewhat skeptical of the current political and legal salience of protections in an increasingly secular society. I want to explore tonight some of the reasons for that skepticism. And here I think it's important to situate the current cultural moments. One of the most important observations is that religious liberty challenges in recent years have increasingly focused on issues of sex, especially the issues at the core of the culture wars, gay rights and abortion. Now, we'll likely see a continued migration of transgender issues to the fore in the coming years, and here in Springfield, you've already experienced some of those challenges. The addition of transgender issues is going to bring some conceptual challenges in both directions. It's going to put pressure on progressive appeals to more abstract notions of equality, which have produced, to quote George Orwell, several different meanings which can no longer be reconciled with one another. You can see this in fascinating articles about places like Wellesley College, an all-women's school, now wrestling with the implications of an increasing transgender population. In the other direction, we're going to see pressures on conservative religious ethics insofar as transgender issues raise questions distinct from sexual practices. But by and large, the transgender questions are not yet at the hub of the cultural conflict, and when it comes to religious liberty, we're still primarily focused on gay rights and abortion. And then it's the case, actually, that these issues aren't really confined to sex. Sex gives us the headlines, but significant questions about transcendence, individualism, technology, and autonomy play into, and in some ways broaden these conflicts. These related issues deserve far greater attention, and in some ways any discussion about religious liberty and civil rights would be incomplete without thinking about them. But given the time constraints, I'm going to set them aside. There's some great books on the role of technology and social media and how all of these things play into and affect these debates, but we'll bypass them here. I'm always worried about the Marco Rubio water thing. The second observation is that these contested areas of religious liberty have focused primarily on legal and policy concerns of conservative Catholics and evangelicals. That is to say, recent religious liberty challenges have largely, though not entirely, been affecting conservative Christians. And they are largely, though not entirely, affecting white conservative Christians, at least for the moment. Now, this observation is not to say that religious liberty is only for white conservative Christians. The Supreme Court's most recent religious liberty case, earlier this year, upheld the statutory right of a Muslim man to grow a religious beard in prison. In the history, the long-standing history of religious free exercise, owes most of its content to religious minorities: the Mormons, Christian Scientists, Native American spiritualists, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. But the faces of today's most prominent religious liberty cases are all white Christians. Susanna Tabor, Hobby Lobby, the New Mexican photographer, the Washington florist, and Tim Davis. I've tried hard to brainstorm a clever way to capture shorthand this group, but I've come up empty, so I'm going to use instead a label that others have used, the traditionalists, to describe this group. It's somewhat clunky, but it's not as bad or verbally ambiguous as the label that some have attached to the religiously non-affiliated, the so-called nuns. So we'll talk about the traditionalists and the nuns going forward. A few things to mention about the traditionalists. First of all, they really aren't only whites. I'm generalizing here for expediency and calling them white traditionalists, but there are some important multi-ethnic traditionalist institutions. Second, contrary to some progressive hopes, the traditionalists aren't just old men. They include substantial numbers of young people and women, and not just the Kim Davises of the world. In some Catholic circles, more so than evangelical ones, there is more racial diversity. But generally speaking, there remains a certain kind of insularity among white evangelicals and Catholics and their institutions. Working in the background of these insularity challenges, and soon to be foregrounded, is what I'll call the Jim Crow analogy. Whether today's traditionalists are equivalent to segregationists, and particularly whether traditionalist views about sexuality and the boundaries that follow from them are analogous to race-based discrimination in the Jim Crow South. That comparison also foregrounds the question of remedy, whether the extraordinary and unprecedented legislative and judicial responses to Jim Crow should be deployed today. Let's call this the Bob Jones question, after the case out of South Carolina in which the Supreme Court struck the tax-exempt status of a white evangelical school, and I'll return to the Bob Jones question later in the discussion. Another aspect of the current cultural moment is what I'll call the diminishing salience of religious liberty. And I mean this in two ways, constitutionally and culturally. So let me start with the constitutional challenges and lay out some of the history behind the document. The key case here is a 1990 decision, Employment Division against Smith, which involved Native Americans who lost their jobs for using peyotes for religious reasons. The law prohibiting peyote was what's called a generally applicable law. It applied to everyone and did not single out religious believers. So you could not use peyote for social purposes, and you could not use it for religious purposes. The Supreme Court in 1990 decided that a religious liberty claim received no special protection against these generally applicable laws, notwithstanding the First Amendment's guarantee to the free exercise of religion. Now think for a moment of the implications of that conclusion in 1990. Most laws are generally applicable. Most laws do not say this law applies only to religious believers. Instead, it applies more broadly to religious and non-religious citizens alike. So an anti-discrimination law that says you cannot refuse to hire certain people is a generally applicable law. And a law that requires private employers to provide contraception coverage under their insurance programs is a generally applicable law. And the Smith decision says the free exercise clause of the First Amendment does not protect against those particular laws. So what happened in 1990? The public was outraged by the Supreme Court's decision, and Congress responded with legislation known as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA. That legislation at the time had overwhelming bipartisan support, including the ACLU and a host of other progressive organizations. And it passed the Senate in 1993 by a vote of 97-3. So think about that in the U.S. Senate. Whatever passes by 97-3, almost nothing, right? So that's 93. And after RFRA, Congress and the Supreme Court started to engage in a little war about the constitutional boundaries of congressional legislation, and the Supreme Court mostly won that war and invalidated large sections of RFRA. 5 years later, Congress tried to pass another version that would pass constitutional muster, and that legislation, unlike RFRA, died in committee. It went nowhere. So what happened between 1993 and 1998? Well, it turns out to be important to the current story. In those 5 years, in between, people who'd been advocating for gay rights began to worry that strong statutory protections for religious liberty would be harmful to gays and lesbians. particularly in the area of anti-discrimination. So the largely bipartisan coalition that has supported the 1993 legislation crashed completely, and instead of the comprehensive protections that have been sought, Congress enacted what's called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which, as the name suggests, is largely confined to issues of zoning and prisons. That's an interesting sort of convergence in itself, those two issues. It turns out that there was, behind the scenes, someone who was heavily involved in prison ministry who had connections to Congress, and so the prison piece gets into the same bill as the land use piece, and now we have courts trying to figure out what those two have to do in common, and still trying to muddle through that. Now, this is not the whole story I'm telling you. Part of that 93 law, part of RFRA, remains in effect, and many of you know this because of the recent Hobby Lobby case, which upheld RFRA as applied to federal laws under the Affordable Care Act. And also many states have constitutional and statutory protections for religious liberty, some of which are even stronger than the federal protections. So when there's a religious liberty challenge in court, there will often be several different claims. Some of them will be state constitutional claims, state legislative claims, and sometimes federal claims as well. But it turns out that these state-level protections are increasingly difficult to enact. Proposed legislation at the state level in places like Kansas, Arizona, Virginia, Mississippi, and perhaps most famously now Indiana has been in the news. And these recent efforts have encountered fierce political resistance, largely around questions of gay rights. Still, the legislative exception remains one important carve-out to the free exercise decision in the 1990 case in Smith. There's a second important exception to what's generally seen as a constitutional weakening of free exercise. And this is what some scholars refer to as the freedom of the church. The idea that churches are distinct from other civil society organizations, like fraternities, clubs, other kinds of groups. Now hold on to that thought, and as you think about questions asked later or even next week, ask yourself if you think that distinction is right or not. And if not, where would you draw the line? So if you don't see churches as distinct, then what are the meaningful differences between, say, a church and a fraternity or a church and Walmart? And ask yourself whether and how the law might make those distinctions. The Supreme Court in 2012 said there is a difference. This is a case called Hosanna Tabor. The case involved a teacher at a Lutheran school who was fired from her position. She claimed she'd been terminated for a disability in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The school responded, disputed its reason for firing the teacher, said it wasn't because of her disability, but it had a more fundamental claim. And its more fundamental claim was that its reason for firing her did not matter. The school's argument was that a church should be able to select its own ministers without the government second-guessing its decisions. Now notice the slippage of terminology here. This was a teacher at a school, but the school's argument was we're kind of like a church and she's kind of like a minister, and therefore we should have protections about hiring and firing her. And a unanimous 9-0 Supreme Court decided that the school was correct. Now, one of the things here, helping the school side, is that both the school and the teacher viewed her position as somewhat ministerial. So she led some devotionals, she had some theological training, and then perhaps probably most damning to her own position, she claimed the ministerial exception under tax law. So she got some tax benefits for a few years, and then had trouble arguing that she was not a minister. On these facts, the Supreme Court held that the First Amendment grants, quote, special solicitude to religious organizations and protects churches from employment discrimination lawsuits involving certain but not all leadership positions. And this is a doctrine called the ministerial exception. In an important line near the end of its opinion, the Supreme Court said the church must be free to choose those who will guide it on its way. The ministerial exception is a significant protection recognized by the unanimous court. Less clear is the extent to which this protection will translate to other contexts. We know just by the way that law operates at a basic level, it will have some translation. So first and foremost, the freedom of the church will necessarily mean the freedom of the mosque and the freedom of the synagogue under current Establishment Clause doctrine. There's also a second kind of translation here. We saw this in the case itself. Church is big enough to encompass something kind of like church, including this school that was attached to a church, and so the construct of church is brought into something like religious organizations that are not formally houses of worship. And we can envision maybe this concept extending to other forms of religious organizations like soup kitchens or outreach ministries. And the law right now, in the lower course, is going through some of this categorization. We're bound to see, however, more contested arguments when we get to larger and more powerful institutions, formally tied to churches, but with a much bigger financial, economic, and cultural footprint, like universities, for example, or hospitals. And those arguments are going to introduce a fuzziness to the category about this freedom of the church protection, this ministerial exception. If it extends to, say, an elementary school but not a university, why is that? And what's the line the law is drawing there? So this is another real and serious protection for religious exercise, alongside some of the statutes I mentioned. But the Supreme Court's peyote decision from 1990 still drives much of the law, and it's been on the books now for 25 years. That means that the constitutional protections for religious liberty under the First Amendment are somewhat limited outside of protections for churches and ministers, however those categories are defined. And Hobby Lobby, while an important validation of the federal law, is just a statutory case. It does not involve a constitutional principle. It could be undone with new legislation from Congress. My own view is that favorable religious liberty legislation is going to be increasingly difficult to enact in the coming years. And this takes me to the cultural aspect of the diminishing salience of religious liberty. One reason for the coming difficulty is that the theoretical justification for religious liberty is itself under pressure. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of arguments in favor of religious liberty by one of the leading scholars and litigators, Douglas Laycock from the University of Virginia. Professor Laycock offers three justifications for why we protect religious liberty. The first, he says, is people care deeply about religion, and attempts to impose or suppress it have led to a great deal of suffering in the history of the world. And that makes some intuitive sense at a first cut. The second is that because religious beliefs matter so much to believers, some believers will be led to fight, kill, or die for the sake of those beliefs, and it's better to accommodate them. And the third, according to Professor Laycock, is that religious beliefs are of relatively little importance to the government. And I think it's fair to say that each of these justifications was likely applicable at the framing of the First Amendment in the late 18th century. But each is far less persuasive today. Let's start with the desire to avoid human suffering. The framers' familiarity with widespread human suffering resulting from governmental attempts to control religion might not support a contemporary argument if, in fact, the state's methods of control and suppression are today more effective and less deadly than they were in a previous era. A similar argument can be made for the willingness of believers to kill and die for their faith. If large numbers of believers became captive to other values, suppose they became more American than they were Christian, then far fewer might be willing to die, suffer, rebel, or fight for their values. And finally, how about government concern with religious belief? Well, if beliefs about theology, liturgy, and church governance collided with laws enacting governmental norms, take, for example, an anti-discrimination law, then these beliefs are going to become more important to civil government. So this idea that there are these separate spheres and government is relatively unconcerned is a bit out of whack now with the regulatory state that is much more enmeshed in practices and institutions in civil society. I think actually each of these three changes has unfolded in contemporary American society. In other words, the three explanations that Professor Laycock gave us to justify protections for religious liberty have proven to be historically contingent and lack persuasive power in today's cultural debates about the importance of religious liberty. There's another reason that this historically contingent nature of these arguments is problematic, and it's one that Professor Mark Tushnet flagged about 30 years ago. Tushnet wrote, "The constitutional law of religion is founded on a tradition that we no longer fully understand." Despite both liberal and Republican, little L and little r, influences on the framers, the overwhelming success of the liberal tradition means that the Republican tradition is far less available to us today than it was to the framers. Notions like the common good are not cognizable within the liberal tradition. And as Tushnet recognized, we may lack the resources to recover them. I think this diagnosis of the loss of shared convictions and shared principles has been increasingly confirmed. Our society now agrees even less about fundamental questions of truth, meaning, and ethics, or even sometimes whether those categories retain any coherence. And on discrete policy issues, the culture wars show little signs of dissipating. Now, to be sure, I'm not trying to paint too dark of a picture here. The importance of religious freedom as a generalized or abstract concept has not yet lost its salience. Most people like religious liberty just like they like little kittens or ice cream. It's hard to be against these things in the abstract. And indeed, when you look at the political rhetoric from our government, it still strongly supports religious freedom around the globe. And even domestically, we heard similar laudatory language from the president as recently as Pope Francis's recent visit to the States about the importance and significance of religious freedom. But there's a sense in which fewer people today recognize the immediate and practical need of legal protections for religious free exercise. Now, the primary reason why there's less focus on these protections today is that religious liberty has somewhat become a victim of its own success. There are no longer the same active threats to religious liberty that there once were. We no longer enforce blasphemy laws. We don't force people to make compelled statements of belief. We don't impose taxes to support the training of ministers. All of these practices were in place at the founding in our country. They're no longer here. And these changes mean, as a practical matter, many Americans do not depend upon the free exercise right for their own religious liberty. They're free to practice their religion without government constraints. Here, I think the clearest example, the least threatened religious believer in America today, is the progressively oriented Christian, who at once remains a part of the dominant historical and cultural faith in the United States, but his views are largely aligned with contemporary liberal values. It's hard to think of many aspects of progressive Christian faith that confront governmental regulation in a way that implicates religious liberty. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying that progressive Christians hold no views antithetical to government interests. We can point to many elements of the so-called religious left who challenge American policy on war, criminal law, immigration, and the environment, to name a few. When you think about it, most of these arguments pose key questions about the boundaries of religious practice. They are religiously informed policy arguments, not religious free exercise arguments. There are also a growing number of Americans, this is the subset of the nones, who are either actually or functionally non-religious and therefore may feel no personal need for free exercise protections. This group is still relatively small, but it's not insignificant, and it's growing steadily. And importantly, this group has moved from being almost imperceptible at the founding in the late 18th century to sociologically significant today. It's no longer possible to ignore non-believers in framing normative and legal religious liberty arguments, particularly in cases surrounding the Establishment Clause. That reality is nowhere more evident than in the growing recognition that even so-called non-sectarian prayers are incapable of accommodating atheists. Today, both the non-religious and mainstream religious progressives may be less inclined to worry about the contested boundaries of the free exercise right. And at least in some cases, they may view the outer limits of that right as either unimportant or even antithetical to other interests. The Indiana RFRA controversy may be a good indicator. Consider that some commentators for the first time in history began adding scare quotes to the phrase religious liberty. It would be one thing to conclude that the constitutional value of religious liberty should be outweighed by another constitutional value, like equality or non-discrimination. But something quite different is happening when we put religious liberty itself in scare quotes. To be sure, in Indiana, the rhetoric on both sides bordered on the absurd. Conservative radio host Mark Levin contended that opponents of the bill hated America. Family Research Council President Tony Perkins argued that revisions to the law would, quote, cut religious freedom in Indiana. And in the other direction, Apple CEO Tim Cook called Indiana's law a dangerous effort to enshrine discrimination and rationalize injustice. And basketball great turned political commentator Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote in Time magazine that the Indiana RFRA was a step toward establishing an American version of Sharia law. Meanwhile, in Indiana, the crux of the actual legal debate seemed to be whether a few Christian florists and cake bakers, and apparently one hapless pizza joints, should be permitted to refuse to provide their services for a same-sex wedding. That's not an unimportant question. There are important interests on both sides of that question. But regardless of the view of the merits, policy implications do not come close to the surrounding rhetoric that I just recited. I think that Doug Laycock was right to assert that the Indiana RFRA has been misunderstood by some people and deliberately distorted and lied about by others. That's a bad sign for the debates that are still to come, and it might indicate continued pressures on religious liberty. These ongoing clashes, and those that will soon follow in the coming months and years, are increasingly invoking the Bob Jones question, the question I mentioned earlier of whether conservative religious beliefs about sexuality today are analogous to racial discrimination against African Americans in the Jim Crow South. If Bob Jones really is the proper analogy and the proper baseline, and most of the questions raised by Ross Douthat and others are going to arise. Loss of tax exemption for traditionalist ministries and maybe even some churches, the closing down of schools and social service organizations, and the professional purging of traditionalist doctors, lawyers, counselors, and others. And this isn't just an abstract question. Some of you are familiar with the exchange during the oral arguments in the same-sex marriage case when Justice Alito asked the Solicitor General, the top lawyer for the federal government, during the arguments about the Bob Jones question, and Solicitor General Verrilli responded, "It's going to be an issue." Nor did Obergefell itself put this question to rest. Justice Kennedy's opinion did say that the First Amendment ensures that religious organizations and persons are given proper protection as they seek to teach the principles that are so often fulfilling and central to their lives and faiths. But as a number of the dissenting justices pointed out, teaching religion is not the same as exercising religion. And that distinction is going to be worked out in cases still to come. On this particular topic, I'd like to be a bit more normative and a bit more personal. My friend Andy Koppelman, who teaches at Northwestern, and who has long supported gay rights and same-sex marriage, has called the current stage of the culture wars over sexuality a, quote, cleanup operation. Rhetoric is sometimes so strong that I feel like I'll end up being like Hiro Onoda, the Japanese soldier assigned to the Philippines during World War II, who refused to surrender for almost 30 years after the war had ended, until he was found quite some time later. And I suppose I share some affinities with Onoda. I'm half Japanese, and I used to be a military officer. But I'm not sure that I'll be the lone holdout at the end of this war. For starters, I'm not sure I've ever been fighting this war, even though my beliefs and values align largely with one side. Instead of being like Onoda, maybe I'm more akin to a civilian bystander that the victors need to do something about. But I also am not sure that I really feel all that alone. I look around and see lots of other people and lots of other institutions that don't seem to be going away, and that continue to do a lot of good for society. So this raises the question of whether there's a way forward that will support both a legal and a cultural argument for those aspects of civil society that flourish alongside other aspects of civil society, but also recognizing the real diversity of views and ways of life that we have in this country and that actually exist here. I think there may be, but I think it's unlikely to be found in appeals to religious liberty. Instead, arguments for living together in deep difference will likely have to have broader appeal and appeal to broader principles. So what can we do about this question of, if not religious liberty, then what? How does it relate to the rest of society, including those who don't care about religious liberty or who might not benefit from it? Well, we might begin by asking whether we would have been better off today if the framers had focused on the free exercise of conscience rather than the free exercise of religion. Professor Stephen Smith, in a recent book on religious liberty, notes that at the time of the framing, these two terms, religion and conscience, were virtually synonymous. The framers chose religion over conscience and have ensued a lot of debates since then. And here I just want to point out, as a linguistic matter alone, the word conscience would have been a better fit than religion for the trajectory of belief that we've actually witnessed in society here in America. It would have more easily encompassed all kinds of non-religious but deeply held beliefs that we see today. Now, the framers, of course, have no way of knowing this, so we can't blame them too much, but it would have at least had the capacity to be broader. And it might also suggest why courts in recent years have moved away from straight free exercise claims to other rights in the First Amendment that are broader, like the right of speech or the right of association. These rights do not depend on any religion-specific justifications. We don't need Professor Laycock's propositions to justify them. So let's talk for a bit about these other resources. One of them is the First Amendment's right of assembly, the constitutional guarantee that people can form and meet in groups of their own choosing, apart from government, and sometimes antithetical to government or majoritarian norms. I wrote my first book on this right of assembly. It turned out that no one else had paid much attention to it, and I continue to write a fair amount in that area. And I've argued that assembly, both at the time of the founding and still today, and especially when we look back at the history of how social groups and movements actually invoked this right, is capable of providing robust pluralist protections and has filled that role for lots of groups in our nation's history. Now, the current state of the right of assembly is somewhat a mess. I think it's a more promising mess than the current state of religious liberty, and so I'm going to walk through some of the doctrinal problems and then suggest that these problems may still be amenable to correction. One of the problems is that in the last 50 years, assembly has largely been subsumed by two other rights, the rights of speech and association. You think about what you might envision as the prototypical assembly, people gathering for a protest, think Occupy, Black Lives Matter, physical bodies in the streets. That's no longer actually regulated by the right of assembly. It's all about the free speech doctrine that guards these temporal gatherings like protests or parades. There's nothing about the group itself. It's all about what the group says or expresses. Meanwhile, the right of association shelters some groups that extend across time and place, clubs and civic associations, but is somewhat untied to the actual expression in the protest itself. So we have here a free speech framework that focuses on the message a group conveys at the moment of its gathering, and an expressive association framework that focuses on the group that enables the message. But these instrumental approaches ignore and somewhat sever the way that people actually interact with one another in informal spaces, without agendas, without messages. Ideas and movements are formed in the informal spaces of many groups. And when we parse assembly or groups themselves as either just speech and expression or something like association, we miss this inherent connection between a group's existence, its practices, and its message. This turn in First Amendment law undervalues, if not dismisses, important values like dissent, the fostering of internal meaning, the shaping of identity, and the importance of informal interactions. And this shift in the doctrine leaves a hole in our constitutional protections for the private groups of civil society. Here's an example of that hole from a recent opinion by the Ninth Circuit in a case called Truth Against Kent. This represents the current law of the land for a region that includes most of the West Coast. And here now I'm quoting from the courts. This case involved a high school Bible club. And the court held, the requirements that members of this Bible club possess a true desire to grow in relationship with Jesus Christ inherently excludes non-Christians and is therefore a form of invidious discrimination. We have federal courts now saying that if you draw your membership boundaries around any kind of identifiable creed or belief, the mere exclusion of those who don't believe is now a form of invidious discrimination. And one of the reasons the court gets there is that the right of association does no work at all. It doesn't even enter into the mix. The court has no concern for the group itself and only is looking at these other values of what the group might manifest in its message. And the reasoning underlying this analysis has broader implications. So let me shift now to a different hypothetical to illustrate the same point. Suppose that a gay student group, historically of great importance to the gay rights movement in the 1970s, desires to meet together for purely social activities, think dinners, movies, and social events, but doesn't have an outwardly expressive component where it's talking to the broader university. And suppose this group meets at a public university. The group would not qualify under current doctrine for protections under the right of association, just like the Christian Bible Club did not. And that might mean that the state could silence it for any reason. For example, if the majority of voters in the surrounding community viewed it as harmful. Many of us would be uncomfortable with that outcome, but the scenario is still plausible in some parts of the country today. And it ignores the fact that the very existence of the gay student group, like the Christian group, communicates an important message about pluralism and dissent relative to the larger state entity in which it finds itself, something that ought to be of concern to the First Amendment. This attention to protecting diverse groups in civil society means risk because it strengthens pluralism against demands for consensus. It resists what political theorist Nancy Rosenblum has called a logic of congruence, which requires the internal life of organizations to mirror liberal democratic principles and practices. Now, I think this push against this consensus or this logic of congruence, these arguments for pluralism are the best way to understand the First Amendment both historically and today. I also think they're likelier to resonate with the broader culture than religious exceptionalist arguments grounded in religious liberty. And one reason for that belief is that pluralist arguments that undergird First Amendment rights might have greater cultural appeal in the current moment than the free exercise right. In fact, these constitutional arguments rooted in pluralism have consistently provided protections for both religious and non-religious groups, both conservative and progressive movements. These are big tent rights that don't really depend on ideology. Meaningful protections for groups across the spectrum are going to depend on this premise of pluralism, though, the recognition that we live in a society with deep disagreements that permeate our values, our beliefs, our identities, and our groups. All of this difference is putting pressure on a claim uncritically asserted in some circles today, the claim that we're a unified nation that has a common good. This claim does make sense on kind of a surface level. We do share basic agreement about procedural mechanisms and background realities. Most of us find common ground for things like public roads and national defense and fire departments. And we agree when we think about it on many basic features of democratic society. We agree about the right to vote, the right to due process of law, the right to free speech. We disagree sometimes sharply about what those rights mean and how and to what extent they really do manifest to all citizens. We have a baseline at least to recognize the nature of our disagreement. And we also share widespread agreement about some relatively uncontested boundaries of society. Most of us accept laws protecting life and property. Most of us understand that we have to pay taxes to go to jail. Most of us recognize that there is a need for some courts and some law enforcement to make society work. But all of this agreement, when we think about it, tells us quite little about who we are as a people, what our goals should be, or what counts as progress. It tells us very little about what our common good is. When it comes to politics and policies, I think we have some reason to question whether we, the people, ever had a coherent notion of the common good. With the exception of fleeting bursts of patriotism around our greatest wars and greatest tragedies, we've usually lacked a broadly shared common good or common identity. More often, those in positions of power have merely assumed unity by consciously or unconsciously suppressing difference and dissent. What do we do when we recognize this actual difference? Well, there's one bleak possibility, which comes from the philosopher Rousseau, who famously contended, "It is impossible for men to live in peace with those they think are damned." I'd like to think Rousseau was wrong. I'd like to think it's not only possible, but also necessary for us to figure out how to live in peace. And I think we can do so in spite of our deep differences. But we're going to have to think more carefully about the sources and scope of those differences and the resources available to navigate life in spite of them. Let me mention two observations about the current cultural moment that are going to complicate those efforts. The first is that there's a certain long-standing critique of orthodoxy and power that is now being replaced with a new orthodoxy. After 3 decades of stressing the normativity of everything, of critiquing orthodoxy and opening spaces for all kinds of cultural and dissenting viewpoints, there is suddenly a forgetfulness in some corners that there is no such thing as a view from nowhere. We instead today see a striking embrace of a new orthodoxy, hearing claims about being on the right side of history, of doing the right thing, and of avoiding, quote, immoral arguments. That kind of moral certainty was a frightening political tool when used by a Protestant establishment of old, and it is no less frightening in the hands of others today. It is also, I think, short-sighted. If history is any guide, we know that those ascending to political power today are unlikely to hold it in perpetuity. And yet, if a certain kind of progressive openness is now closing, then we have a situation in which critique is being replaced with a new orthodoxy, and the serious question of whether people will be around to listen to arguments of pluralism, because those arguments depend and assume on the legitimacy of critique as a shared premise. The second observation about our current cultural moment cuts in the other direction, and it's an entrenched suspicion in some circles, especially conservative religious circles, that pluralism, or engaging with and allowing robust difference, is a form of relativism. That worry, extracted a bit, is that embracing pluralism means we're left with nothing but an open-ended pragmatism or nihilism, and that worries deeply a number of conservative believers. I think the worry is misplaced. It confuses epistemic claims about what we know with ontological claims about claims to ultimate meaning or truth. The kinds of philosophical arguments that can disentangle worries of relativism from arguments for pluralism are extremely important, and there is a real need to explain these differences more clearly to a wider population, especially among more conservatively oriented religious believers. But importantly, these philosophical arguments are going to need to be accompanied by political practices that are consistent with a pluralist politics. That's a lot of P's in one sentence, let me say that again. The philosophical arguments from religious conservatives will need to be accompanied by political practices consistent with a pluralist politics. Pluralism is not available opportunistically. Religious believers cannot expect to be taken seriously if they invoke pluralism only when it benefits their own interests and not when it benefits the interests of others. So to mention a few concrete examples, conservative Christians are going to need to rethink the extent to which they advocate for Christian or even religious preferences among policy preferences like legislative prayer or prayer in public spaces. Or to take another example, consider the current hysteria against American Muslims from some conservative Christian circles. It's not going to work for conservative Christians to say pluralism for all and then fail to support civil liberties protections for American Muslims. I've begun to refer to the normative vision, the idea that we really can have this robust pluralism, as confident pluralism, and that's the title of the forthcoming book due out this spring. Confident pluralism does not require suppressing or minimizing our firmly held convictions. To the contrary, it allows for the kinds of differences that most people actually hold, rather than papering over the differences for the sake of a falsely claimed meaning. In other words, confident pluralism takes both confidence and pluralism seriously. We can embrace pluralism precisely because we are confident in our own convictions and beliefs, and in the groups and institutions that sustain them. Unlike the middle school bully whose coercion and mean-spiritedness mask profound insecurity, we can engage with and even encourage disagreement out of our own confidence. Confident pluralism will not give us the American dream. I'm not sure if we can get to the American dream, but it might help avoid the American nightmare. It might be likelier to do so than appeals to religious liberty, which will only benefit or appeal to a certain segment of the population. With that, I'll end. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and I look forward to your questions and engagement. And welcome anyone. Thank you.